Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to Lesson 1.4. We are moving toward the end of this unit. Today, now that we have gone over political ideologies, let's take a look at how those impact our political parties and what is the history of our political parties. So today we focus on the political parties. For those of you who don't know, the Democrats are usually represented by a donkey, and the Republicans are represented by an elephant. The easiest way to remember that is Democrat donkey, D and D, and then the elephant is the other one. They also tend to have blue, which goes with the donkey and the Democrats, and the red is usually the Republicans. Here are some key vocabulary that you're going to need to know with dealing with parties. Realignment is when the parties switch the people who belong to them. During the 1800s, the Republicans were actually considered the Liberal Party, and the Democrats were considered the Conservative Party. And then beginning with FDR, that begins to flip-flop. And now the Republican Party is seen as the conservative, and the Democrats are the liberal. And so when that switch happens, that's called realignment. De-alignment is just when parties lose power. And currently we're going through a de-alignment phase in the United States. Parties are not as powerful as they used to be. We'll talk about who is taking up that power. But the fact that parties are losing power, that is known as de-alignment. We've already gone over straight ticket voting. When we went over voting, that is when you vote for the same party up and down a ballot, whereas split ticket voting is when you jump back and forth between Republican candidates and Democratic candidates. Grassroots is just when you have the support of regular people, kind of Bernie Sanders when he started off. He started off as a grassroots movement. He just really gathered the influence and the attention of regular people, and then his power grew over time and as his supporters grew. So that's grassroots. Gridlock is when things shut down. Right now in our government, some argue that we are in gridlock because the Republicans and the Democrats can't get along and they can't agree to anything, and so therefore nothing is getting done. And then finally, the party platform was just agreed to by the Republicans and the Democrats at their conventions. The Democrats had their convention last week. The Republicans had it this week. And the party platforms are just the party stances on every issue known to man. So if you want to know where the Republicans and the Democrats stand on an issue, you find their political platform. And they update that platform every 4 years at their party conventions. So now let's get into what a political party is. Very simply, a political party is just an organization of people who share the same ideas about government. But here is what's important. They have an actual purpose, and their purpose is to dominate government. They want to dominate all branches of government. And so the Republicans and Democrats want to have as many people in the in the executive and legislative branches as possible. If you can dominate government, then you can get your party platforms passed. So how do you dominate government? Well, you have to run candidates. And so parties will run candidates to get elected to office in order to be able to dominate government. And again, if they get a majority of their people in government, then they will try to pass laws usually related to their party platform. Now, party membership in the United States is totally voluntary. You can join parties or you can just stay outside of this. And you can switch parties. That's totally okay as well. Both parties claim to be big tent parties, meaning that they have lots of different types of people. And we're going to go over that later on in this slide, or in this PowerPoint. So hold on that big tent party philosophy, and we'll hit that in just a little bit. Political parties are linkage institutions. They are institutions that help link their people to the government. And they do that by getting people to either run for office, or political parties help people run for office, and people join parties in order to help people run for office. And so that's what a linkage institution does. We're going to study 3 in the United States: political parties, interest groups, and the media. Those are all considered linkage institutions. And the linkage institution is a very important thing. It's a very important concept. And we're going to study the big 3. So in your notes, if you wanted to make a little linkage institution triangle and put political parties, interest groups, and the media, those are going to be the big 3 that we're going to study. Parties are not mentioned in the Constitution, so this is totally done just by tradition. Here's a little quote that explains what we just went over. Political parties are organizations that try to win control of government by electing people to public office who carry the party label. So what is the job of the political party? And we already said it's a linkage institution, but really they have 5 things. Political parties pick candidates to run for office. Political parties then help that candidate run their campaigns. These days, a little less so than what has been in the past. And Donald Trump definitely did not have as much Republican support 4 years ago when he ran, because he is now kind of taken over the party. They definitely are helping him a lot more. Parties give cues to voters. So once you know that somebody is a Republican, you understand kind of what they believe politically. If somebody is a Democrat or calls themselves a Democrat, you understand what they believe politically. And so it helps give cues to voters. They also articulate policies. That's by creating their party platforms, which we just discussed. And they try to make government work a little bit better by having similar philosophies if they can dominate the different branches of government. So those are the 5 things that parties do. You're going to want to have those 5 things listed. There is a theory called the rational choice theory. And it's basically a political philosophy that states that voters will vote for whatever politician best supports what they want. And so they make a rational choice on who to vote for. Because people vote that way, parties know that the more their views attract people, they are more likely to get elected. So they're going to take stances on issues that are going to attract as many people as possible. And so because most voters in the United States are more moderate, the parties tend to take more moderate positions. But as we know over time, and we're going to study this, the Republicans and Democrats have actually started to move more to the left and to the right, which is called party polarization, and we're going to talk about the impact of that. You need to understand how the parties are set up. You would think that they're one giant organization, and they're really not. They really are 3 independent organizations that have a loose connection with each other. The smallest part is the National Party, and that makes up the smallest group of people. The National Party really only comes together every 4 years at their convention, usually just to nominate a presidential candidate. And so last week the Democrats did that. This week the Republicans are doing that. Most party stuff is done at the state and local level. So Each state has a Republican and Democratic Party, and each local area usually has, like St. Louis or even Baldwin, have local chapters. And usually the way that things work is people usually get involved at the local level, and then if they see some success, then they try to go for state office. And then if they see success there, then they try to get involved in national politics. But they are really three separate institutions. The Republican National Party has very little knowledge about what's going on here in Baldwin, Missouri, as far as the Republicans go, or even really at the state level. And so these are three real different organizations that loosely come together. But the party hierarchy is really three, and so you need to know that. So right now the parties are coming together, and this is just a little information for you that you don't need to jot down, but they meet every 4 years again to nominate the presidents, and we said that they also write their party platforms at this time, and then they make their formal nominations for the president. Right now the Democrats are led by a gentleman by the name of Tom Perez, and the Republicans are led by a lady named Rhonda Romney McDaniels. And so they sort of head the organizations, and they are selected by their party. So the Democrats selected Tom Perez, and the Republicans selected Rhonda Romney McDaniel. In the United States, what do we have? Are we a one-party, two-party, or multi-party system? Answer that in your head. 3, 2, 1. You are correct if you said we are a two-party system. Similarities in the major parties, they all pretty much do these things. Differences is basically what's the role of government. The Democrats believe that government should have a major role in people's lives. The Republicans have a minor role, and that is because the Democrats tend to be more liberal, and this is a liberal philosophy, and the Republicans tend to have a more conservative philosophy, and this is what a conservative philosophy would look like. In a multi-party system, and there are some countries that I have listed there that have this, what are the advantages of having a multi-party system? Well, obviously, one major advantage is that you have more choice. But the disadvantage is that it's harder to gain a majority, and thus you have to sometimes form what are called coalition governments. And a coalition government is when parties will come together temporarily to work with each other to form a majority. The problem with coalition governments is that they're usually not very stable, and they break up over time because they disagree on some issue, and then they basically have a divorce. And Italy is a perfect example of this. But again, you do have more choice, but it's harder to form governments, and those governments usually do not last as long. All right, so when we talked about the big tent idea, each party believes that they are a big tent party, meaning that they have lots of different groups that make up their makeup. And we talked a little bit today in class about the socialization and what kind of people lean liberal and lean conservative, and that kind of goes into this. So how is the Republican Party a big tent party? Let's talk about the coalitions or groups that currently are making up the Republican Party. And so these would be the different groups under the big tent known as the Republican Party. Number one, you've got your social conservatives. Another way of saying this is your religious conservatives. So these would be made up of your evangelical Christians, people who believe that you should live your life according to the Bible, or people who just believe in certain social issues like abortion or gay rights. And so the more conservative element of these people make up your social conservatives. Donald Trump has the support of these people, even though his lifestyle may not necessarily equate to what they see as a perfect example of that. Number two, you have your fiscal conservatives. These are conservatives that believe that government spending needs to be kept very much under check and needs to actually be reduced because we have way too much debt. And so this used to be a big tenet of the Republican Party, and then under Trump, they kind of lost their way. And so it'll be interesting to see whether or not these people stay in the party or move somewhere else or just sort of drop their idea of being fiscally conservative or not. And so we'll see about the fiscal conservatives. Number 3, your national defense conservatives. These are the people who believe that the United States needs to have a strong military and that strong military will be a presence for good in the world. Donald Trump has definitely believed in this. He has upped military spending during his first term as president. And we'll see whether or not that continues or not. But that has been always a big mainstay with the Republican Party. These 3 groups are sort of your traditional Republicans. Donald Trump really brought in the anti-immigrant conservatives, and one of the things that he ran for, seems like since day one, is this anti-immigrant philosophy. And so these are now the new Trump Republicans. They're talking about building the wall along the Mexican-American border, restricting immigration, which they have done, locking up illegal immigrants, and breaking up children and families. And so these are your new Republicans that really focus on the immigration element and not trying to form sort of a compromise with the Democrats, but taking a very hardcore stance. And then another group that came in right around 2010, just after Obama was elected president, are your libertarians. These people were your small government conservatives. They were known as the Tea Party. And they sort of melded into the Republican Party. These are your people who just want to see government do very little. And Donald Trump has really backed them into his administration, and he has really cut a lot of positions in the government, or not filled them a lot, because he is listening to these small government conservatives. So these 5 groups kind of make up the current Republican Party big tent party, and these are your 5 coalitions or groups. Now the Democrats have their own coalitions, and they are their own big tent, but theirs looks a lot different. And so number 1, you have labor unions and workers. Now Donald Trump did do a much better job at winning over some of these people during the 2016 election. Unions still went for the Democratic Party, but Donald Trump made inroads with this group, and it'll be interesting to see whether or not that happens or not here in the 2020 election. Number 2 are minorities, and this is right now a large segment of the Democratic Party. African Americans, Hispanics, LGBTQ. These minorities make up the Democratic Party, and really for Joe Biden, African American and African American women in particular really fueled his comeback, and so that potentially is the reason why he chose an African American vice presidential candidate. Hispanics are kind of complaining right now that they're not feeling the love, so it'll be interesting to see what Joe Biden does to try to gain Hispanics back into this mix in a stronger way. Women lean liberal, and we talked about that during our look at the demographics of liberals and conservatives. The Democratic Party is much more female than the Republican Party is. And then your social liberals, your progressives, your uber liberals, your Bernie Sanders and your Elizabeth Warrens, people who want to see a more progressive government. And so these are the 4 groups that make up the big tent of the Democratic Party. So you're going to have to know the difference between the Republican tent and the Democratic tent. And again, here are your coalitions and just which way. These are all, again, these are also what we call demographics, and that's what we studied in class today. And it just shows you how they break down with the Republicans and Democrats. So we went over this today in class as well. Here's some other things that you can just jot down in your notes. I'm going to have you pause that and let you come back. These aren't things that I'm going to make you know, but these are just things to understand in general. So this is really just optional. Here is review question number 1, review question number 2, and you can pause, review question number 3. And now I just want to talk real quickly about third parties in America. Do they make a difference? Do we need more today? Basically, third parties have had a very weak influence in American politics. We have pretty much always been a two-party nation. But when we do have third parties, they usually are made up of one of 4 reasons why they sort of pop up and exist. So reason number 1, there's a new political ideology that pops up and a party forms based on that ideology. Think Libertarian Party, the people who want really small government. Or think of Communist Party in the 1930s and whatnot. Really, there's not much going on today ideologically that's different. But certainly the Libertarians would be one. Or the Tea Party would be an example of this. Although we can see the Tea Party is also going to be down here. So let's go down here. Economic protest. When economics gets bad in the United States, when things start to go bad for our economy, then we start to see third parties pop up that offer different solutions. When we started to have issues with big government spending, the Tea Party movement came along and said, we really need to cut back on deficits and debts. And they really have formed as much for ideological reasons as for economic reasons. Usually why third parties form is going to be number 3, the single issue party. These are parties that focus on one particular issue. And the biggest one that I can talk about today is the marijuana party, or all of your pro-drug parties. And they form simply because they want to have a legalization of either marijuana or other drugs in general. But really the marijuana is the one that you see the most of today. Every blue moon, Republicans or Democrats will break away from the party because they have an issue that really they can't get around. Or, so for instance, in the 1940s, the Dixiecrats broke away from the Democrats because of segregation. The Democrats were moving to support desegregation, and there were some Southern Democrats that were still in favor of segregation. They break away and form the Dixiecrats and then really get absorbed by the Republican Party. And that's usually what happens to third parties in general. They get picked up by one of the big two parties. But splinter parties, also the famous one is the Bull Moose Party, when Teddy Roosevelt didn't think that the Republicans were progressive enough, and so he broke away from the Republican Party and ran as a Bull Moose Party, and he obviously lost. But those are sort of the 2 big splinter parties, and it's a splinter because they break away from the big parties. And so here's just a review of those same 4 reasons why third parties exist. So basically here we have some graphs that show how people lean as far as their party identification goes, and you can see that all parties are relatively similar. We talked about how de-alignment means that parties are weak. Why is that? Well, there's some systematic reasons. One is that we have 3 levels of government. We have a federal government, we have state governments, and we have local governments. And because they are broken up into 3 levels, that sort of weakens parties because, as we said before, those 3 segments don't always work together. Also, separation of power. Congressional Republicans don't always get along with the president, even though that they are Republican, because they are of a different branch of government, and so they want their branch to be most powerful. So there's some built-in conflict there. Culturally, we just don't hang out with people only of one party. We have friends that are all sorts of others. They are big tent parties, so they tend to take a more moderate stance in things. And because of the TV and the internet, candidates can really fundraise on their own with the internet and run their own political ads with TV and the internet. And so they don't need parties to do that, whereas 70 years ago, they really needed the party to help them do all that. Are we hopelessly divided? We said early on that the parties are starting to move away from each other, and they're starting to take on more hardcore views, or their people are a little bit more hardcore about their policies. And that's what polarization is. Polarization is that you have a number of people who say, I am a hardcore liberal or conservative, not extreme, but you're just, I am very liberal, I am very conservative. You're seeing people become less moderate is basically what this is saying. Or you are seeing that that the parties themselves are becoming more extreme themselves, that they are taking on more extreme views, or their candidates are more extreme. And I'm going to show you an example of that in just a second. So here you can see that in 1994, on the political spectrum, this is basically where the median Democrat was, and you can see by 2017 that it had shifted to the left. Same thing with the Republicans, more to the center in 1994, then they shift to the right. And then you can see that the unfavorable rates of the other party go up. Each party hates the other party a lot more in 2017 than they did in 1994. Percentage of people who always vote, consistently conservative, consistently liberal. You can see that the conservatives have the advantage there. People who contribute to a political candidate, lately it's been more of the liberals who have than the conservatives, even though the conservatives are usually seen as the richer party. Realignment, or political polarization. This is a look at members of Congress, and you can see how there are some the Democrats over here, the Republicans are over here, but you see a lot of people in the middle or closer to the middle. And that just shows you that they were working together. But what happens over time is that you start to see the parties move away from each other, and they're holding less moderate views. And now by 2011, you see very little moderation, and you're seeing that the parties are really moving to their edges. And that has some very big impacts, including gridlock, which means that, again, the government's not doing anything. And that their candidates tend to be more extreme. You could use Donald Trump as an example. You could use Bernie Sanders on the Democratic example as well. So congressional gridlock, government shutdowns. If they can't agree on a budget, then they just shut the government down, which is no good for anybody. The rise of other parties. In 2010, it was the Tea Party. Here, again, you can see how they used to be closer together, and now they are moving further apart. And this is just in the Senate. And then you have some, again, practice questions here. So that is our look at political parties. Thanks for hanging in there with me. I'm going to be posting sort of a graphic organizer that will help you coalesce this information. But this is our look at political parties. Thanks a lot.